Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. Big hugs to everybody, and do let us know how you're doing or where in the world you're from. And go and get yourself something lovely to drink, and if it's something unusual, as I always say to my listeners, tell me what it is, because we have a wide variety of passions when it comes to what we drink. So let me know about that. So let's continue with part 2 of our story. And in this story, we have a young boy called Edward, whose mother is pregnant with twins. But how did she go about getting pregnant? That is the very big question. What kind of thing did she employ to get pregnant? Because she'd been struggling for a very, very long time. So let's find out what's going on in the story. And let's continue with part 2 of the story. "Would you say hello to Zara Witchin, love?" said Julia Barry to her son Edward. Edward politely looked up at Zara Witchin. Her eyes were framed by thick lashes, and her arched brows had been plucked very severely, within an inch of their lives, so it almost looked as if Zara had drawn an arched pencil line across them. Edward trembled as he said, "Hello," to Zara. He knew with every single fibre of his being there was something nefariously sinister and insidiously predatory about this woman, that nobody else appeared to notice. But to Edward, being able to see this was very easy, like discerning the difference between a red double-decker toy bus from a London taxicab. At 10 years old, Edward's young body was cautioning him to stay well away from Zara Witchin. She seemed profoundly evil. Why Edward felt this so instinctively, he didn't know. But he'd watched enough horror movies over the years with his mother, against his father's wishes, of course, as Wayne Barry had distinctly told his wife, in no uncertain terms, that letting a 10-year-old boy watch horror movies with her would easily disturb his sleep and give him nightmares. Julia had waved her hand nonchalantly at her husband and told him he was talking nonsense, and it was fun to be scared half to death. While this might have been true, being scared by a horror movie on television was completely different compared to being scared by a stranger who had just entered their kitchen, who came across to little Edward as being like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Edward had often heard the pastor at church talk about wolves in sheep's clothing. He had warned his congregation of such people, pretending to be godly when they were anything but. Zara Witchin's outer veneer seemed pretty ordinary, although she did have a very unflattering hook-like nose, which would have looked good on a man, but on a woman it made her look, well, rather severe. Zara had long black shiny hair that fell down to her waist. Edward had never seen such long hair before. Zara's skin was so white that even the white paint on the kitchen table seemed yellow by contrast. But it was those dark, soulless eyes that troubled Edward the most. There was something guileful and perfidiously cunning about her eyes that didn't seem altogether human. And the way they suddenly went white for a few minutes had scared the bejesus out of him. Edward had never witnessed anybody's eyes cloud over like that before, but he could see by the satisfied smirk on Zara Witchin's face that the woman had clearly wanted Edward to see her eyes cloud over, for it obviously gave her some kind of Machiavellian kick to scare him half to death. "Tell me, how old are you, little Edward?" she asked, her dagger-like eyes piercing through him, while a grin crawled across her face like a spider. Again a cold shiver ran down Edward's little spine, so much so that he was overcome with a nauseating, unpleasant feeling of impending dread that made his entire body quiver and shake, rather like that of a baby's rattle. "I'm 10 years old," he said rather gingerly, refusing to meet Zara's gaze. He didn't want to look into her eyes, for he knew if she saw how scared and intimidated he was by her, it would give her great satisfaction. "Well, it's very good to meet you," said Zara, offering him a cold, clammy hand to shake, where ugly blue veins protruded through her white skin. Edward privately shuddered in disgust. Everything about Zara Witchin was odiously foul, and even the perfume she wore smelt exactly like the fish moth balls his mother put in the closet to scare away all the moths. Edward did not want to shake Zara Witchin's hand, if he could possibly help it, but his mother was staring at him expectantly. Edward knew instinctively he had to be polite, or he'd be severely reprimanded by his mother, who couldn't abide rudeness of any kind. Edward had always been taught to be polite, so he inwardly flinched as apprehensively he took Zara Witchen's hand in his. The woman's ice-cold frosty hands felt like claws on his skin. She squeezed Edward's hand so tightly it really hurt, but Edward clenched his teeth tightly together to mask the pain he was feeling, for he didn't want Zara to know that she'd hurt him badly. He was certain that such a revelation would please her. She was clearly the kind of woman who got satisfaction from hurting things. Edward was sure of it. He inwardly sighed with relief when finally she let go of his hand, albeit a little reluctantly. Zara Witchen appeared to thankfully have suddenly lost interest in little Edward. Probably she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted from him, for he wasn't playing ball with her, and had not shown her how truly affrighted he was by her. Zara promptly joined Edward's mother and her two friends Angie and Lisa to settle around the kitchen table. Julia Barry had made a particular fuss over tea that morning, probably to impress their new guest. There were platters of tuna, egg mayonnaise, and ham and cheese sandwiches laid out rather resplendently across the table, along with plates of scones with jam and clotted cream, as well as thick slices of angel food cake that had been iced with a non-fat frosting that tasted of lemons and was decorated with sliced strawberries. Zara Witchen was warmly received by Edward's mother Julia, who had effusively welcomed her into the kitchen, treating her rather like an esteemed celebrity of note. Julia Barry seemed rather excited. Her hands trembled rather uneasily as she poured out tea from her finest bone china teapot, which she only ever used on very special select occasions, such as Thanksgiving and Christmas. So the fact that his mother had brought out the fancy tea service that morning showed that she really wanted to make a good impression on her guest. Julia Barry blushed with embarrassment. Her face grew as pink as a peony, because she was doing a clumsy job of filling up Zara Witchen's teacup, for the tea spilled and splattered into the saucer and very nearly trickled onto Zara's lap. It would seem that Julia Barry was unusually flustered that morning. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Zara," she apologized profusely. "I'm not normally such a dreadful klutz. You must forgive me. I'm just so excited to finally meet you. I've heard so much about you from my best friend Angie over here. Angie's been raving about you non-stop, especially after you read her tarot cards. She tells me everything you told her about herself and her life was absolutely true. She was so impressed by your accuracy. You told her that she'd been divorced 2 times, and there's no way you could have known that. You also said she was currently seeing another man, who she'd soon marry, and you were dead right on that. Duncan Pastel, who Angie has been dating for over 3 years now, asked Angie to marry him only the other day. You told Angie that they would get married, and now they're engaged," said Julia, letting out a laugh. "That's right, I told her she'd marry the man she was seeing, who wouldn't mess her around like the other men have done." "I know," said Julia, her face lighting up like a Christmas tree. "Angie also told me when her dog Bo went missing, you knew exactly where Bo would be found. Angie's been through 2 divorces, so Bo is particularly special to her. And when her beloved dog went missing, she was devastated and feared that Bo was dead and had been run over by a car. You told her that Bo was very much alive, and you said you could see the dog in a green field with buttercups trapped in some big hole in the ground that looked rather like an unfilled grave. Well, Angie said she knew the field you were talking about very well, and had not thought to even go and look in there. You see, Angie's backyard overlooks a field of buttercups, but she didn't know that Bo had dug a hole under her fence so that he could access the field. And the buttercup field happened to belong to her next-door neighbour, a man called Mr. Meaton. So Angie contacted him at once and told him where you had said that little Bo would be found. Mr. Meaton, would you believe it, admitted he'd actually dug a hole in the field. The hole resembled a grave, just like you described. Mr. Meaton has got a 12-year-old son, you see, who went playing around in the field one day and he came across some ancient coins and arrowheads in a Pacific area in the field. Some, I understand, that are of significant value. Well, Mr. Meaton was understandably terribly excited about his son's discovery, so asked his 12-year-old boy to show him exactly where he'd found the coins. He took along with him a metal detector to use over the area, to see if he could retrieve more of them. It would seem his metal detector kept going off madly, in one particular spot. So Mr. Meaton dug 8 foot under the ground, as if he was digging a large grave. And it was in that spot he discovered dozens more of these coins, all contained in a metal container. There was a photograph in there and a few old letters. It really was a significant find. Mr. Meaton had not got around to filling in the hole, so he rather suspected from the description of where Bo could be found, who is, of course, Angie's dog, that he was probably in the field and had accidentally fallen into the hole that he dug. And lo and behold, when Mr. Meaton took Angie to the open hole in the ground, there was little Bo, looking very sorry for herself, because she was trapped in that grave and couldn't get out. The poor little mite was not happy, but very happy to see Angie, and desperately thirsty, I believe. I hasten to say, even though Angie has not covered up the hole under her fence that goes straight into Mr. Meaton's buttercup field, the dog has not had any desire to go in there any more. I guess she certainly learnt her lesson. Well, that's very good to hear, said Zara. I was told by the spirit that I conjured exactly where little Bo would be found. The spirits never let me down, you see. Well, that's exactly why I invited you over to tea, Zara, said Julia. Angie insists that, like you helped her, she believes likewise you'll be able to help me. And let's just say, I'm badly in need of help, let me tell you. There is a big vacuous hole in my life, rather like the hole that Mr. Meaden dug in the field of buttercups, that Bo unfortunately had to fall into. There's a hole inside me very similarly, that desperately needs to be filled. It's rather like an empty void that has left me feeling rather bereft and restlessly discouraged, almost as if there's a roadblock in my life, stopping me from moving forward. I would describe myself rather like a writer that has developed writer's block, not knowing what else to write on the page, as I have no idea how to move forward, if you know what I mean. I feel stuck and uninspired, as if my life has completely lost its purpose. I'm very sorry to hear you say that, Mrs. Barry. From what you're saying, you sound as if you're rather lost, as without children, you feel as if you've lost your purpose in life, and you're very unsure of the road ahead of you, or where to go to from here. Am I right? Well, absolutely. That's an excellent way to put it, Julia Barry admitted. That is exactly how I feel. Well, I will try my best for you, Mrs. Barry, said Zara Witchin. But I'm making no promises to you, because ultimately the decision of whether to help you or not is not mine to make. It depends on the spirits I conjure up. I will see what I can do for you, but I cannot guarantee that your wish of having another baby will be fulfilled. But on the other hand, if you are willing to give something of yourself, there is no reason you cannot get the desires of your heart. You do, of course, understand what I am saying by this, Mrs. Barry. To get something, you need to give something back, for that is how the universe works. It's called the law of reciprocity, which I'm sure you are familiar with from biblical teachings in the church. You've probably listened to over the years, I imagine. Oh, but of course, I know all about that. My mother taught me about the importance of giving when I was growing up as a girl. You have to give to receive. I think everyone knows that. When you say I need to sacrifice something, what is it that I need to give up? Julia Barry asked rather tentatively, sensing that things might not be as straightforward and uncomplicated as she had originally hoped they would be. Zara Witchin was ambiguously vague when it came to answering the question. She said, "No one knows what you will be expected to give up, Mrs. Barry, until, of course, your wish is finally granted. I, for one, cannot ascertain what spirit will ask of you. Sometimes they demand a little. Sometimes they demand much. It's rather like throwing a dice. You never know what you're going to get." Goodness gracious me, said Julia Barry. When you talk about wishes being granted like this, you sound exactly like a fairy godmother, like the one in Cinderella. I wouldn't exactly describe myself that way, said Zara candidly. I'm definitely not as sweet as the fairy godmother in Cinderella. On the contrary, I would say I'm not sweet at all. Well, I'm going to be straight with you, Zara, as you have been with me, and lay all my cards on the table. Let's just say I would give absolutely anything to have another baby, said Julia Barry frankly. Me and my husband Wayne, we've tried for 10 long years to have more children, but no matter what we did, even things like leaving me suspended with my legs high up in the air half the day, in the hope that a miracle would transpire, well, none of that worked. And believe me, we tried every inventive and creative idea we could think of. It was absolutely soul-destroying, to say the very least. Naturally, we visited a plethora of fertility clinics that promised the world but delivered nothing. None of these clinics were able to help us. I know my husband Wayne has been bitterly disappointed that we've only had one child, even though he adores little Edward as much as I do. But we both wanted so much more for our family. My husband naturally hides his feelings from me. He doesn't want me to feel bad about myself. But I have to tell you, there are times I have felt that I am not a proper woman, even though I have managed to at least have one child. If Edward hadn't arrived on the scene, I can't even imagine that. I'm not sure I'd even be here now, because I would feel utterly devastated to have been blessed with no children. Well, not blessed, actually. Let's just say I feel incomplete in my life. I so badly wanted to be a mother, to have more than one child. If the truth be told, since I was a little girl, I wanted a large family. When Wayne and I got married, we talked about nothing less. We ambitiously fancied ourselves as having dozens of kids running around and about the place. When I first met Wayne, I was a kindergarten teacher, you see. So I've always loved children. So only having one has made me feel so very unaccomplished. I hasten to say, eventually I saw a leading gynecologist, one of the best in the country, most highly esteemed in his field. His name was Nate Hooper. Now he's a very good man, who's helped couples conceive against all the odds stacked against them. Many couples who've been discarded, abandoned and spat out by other gynecologists have actually been treated by Nate Hooper, with great success, I might add. Nate Hooper has worked miracles for many young couples, but alas, not for us. And I'm not exactly sure why that is. As you can imagine, I had such high hopes and expectations when me and my husband went to see Nate Hooper, due to all the luck that barren couples appeared to be having with him. I was certain that our luck was about to change for the better, but I was so wrong about that. In truth, Nate Hooper candidly told me, in no uncertain terms, that there is nothing physically wrong with me, and no viable reason why I shouldn't fall pregnant. So the fact that I haven't been able to conceive has really perplexed him. My husband naturally got checked out as well, in case the problem rested with him. But according to Nate Hooper, my husband has a higher than average sperm count. So why I never fell pregnant is completely beyond me. It's been 10 long years since Edward was born, and every time me and my husband Wayne have thrown out the rod, hypothetically speaking, nothing has been biting at the end of our line, if you know what I mean. Nate Hooper has been stumped by all this, as have I and my husband. He had absolutely no answers for us, especially given that I fell pregnant with Edward within months of marrying Wayne. So why I suddenly appear to be barren is decidedly enigmatic, and beyond that exceedingly frustrating. Well, I'm very sorry to hear that things have been so tough for you, said Zelda Witchen sympathetically. It can't have been easy for you, since you've always wanted to have a huge family, and you only ended up with one boy, even though I can see little Edward over there is a delightful child. But then again, many couples feel unfulfilled if they don't have more than one child. So I do understand how unsatisfied you feel. Well, growing up, it was just me and my sister, and I always used to think it would be absolutely wonderful if I had dozens of brothers and sisters running around, Julia Barry admitted. I dreamt of it all the time, actually. But my parents strictly only wanted 2 kids. So that was that. But then I always considered that one day, when I finally got married, our family would be like the Waltons, because we would have dozens of children. It was Angie Hartman who abruptly interceded in the conversation, focusing her attention on Zara Witchen. So that's why I told Julia about you, she interjected. I told her about what you've done to help me find my missing dog Bo, along with that incredible accurate tarot card reading you did for me, which was absolutely incredible. I knew if anybody could help Julia here, it would be you, Zara. So she's been so terribly excited to meet you. Over the years, I've seen how visibly upset Julia has become, not being able to have any more children. I'm very close to Julia, you see, and I'm also Edward's godmother. So I feel it's my duty to help Julia in any way I can. Julia here has been remarkably stoic and incredibly courageous about it all. She's always positive, you know, and upbeat. But I know underneath it all she's really hurting, because it hasn't been easy for her. That's why I reached out to you, Zara, in the hope you might be able to help her. Because I know for Julia, not having another child has been so devastating for her. Edward's mother's 2 friends, Lisa Walker and Angie Hartman, were regular visitors to the Barry household. Edward tuned into the woman's conversation eagerly, as this time he was curious as to what the adults were talking about, as their focus appeared to be on Zara Witchen. Edward realized they had brought this strange woman into their house because they believed she could fix a multitude of problems for them, like the agony aunts his mother always listened to on the radio, that offered all kinds of advice to housewives, from how to keep their husbands interested in them all the time, and how to turn yourself into a domestic goddess. Edward had never heard his mother express an interest in having more children. When he was younger, he'd asked about it often enough. He had begged his mother for a brother and sister. Edward's mother had looked at him rather sorrowfully and said, "Sweetheart, it's not for me to decide whether you have a brother or sister or not. It's in God's hands." And from that, Edward had assumed it was God's will. So if he didn't have a brother and sister, he was accepting of that fact. Normally Edward wasn't remotely interested in what the adults had to say, but this time he could not help but tune in to their conversation, which was so much more interesting than usual. Normally his mother's friends garrulously gossiped about various people at church. But on this occasion, with their strange, unorthodox visitor, who had entered the kitchen and brought in with her an icy chill, it had made it close to impossible for Edward to ignore what they had to say. So he pretended to play with his collection of dinky toys. But he really felt it was like having a rattlesnake in the room, that you needed to watch very carefully in case the rattlesnake suddenly struck you down with its poisonous bite, because that's what it was like, having Zara Witchen in their kitchen. There was no doubt that this woman was scary. On the surface to look at, she seemed pretty ordinary, but her attire she wore was dramatically different to what the other ladies wore, who were wearing cotton frocks with colourful skinny belts and matching shoes. Zelda Witchen, on the other hand, was wearing a long black dress that fell to above her shoes. The dress was nipped in at the waist. It had puffy sleeves, and there were buttons going all the way down to the bottom of the dress. It was like something a governess in the 1800s would likely have worn, and was distinctly unfashionable for the time. Zelda also wore ugly black leather lace-up boots that looked strange to be wearing with a dress. She wore a necklace around her neck, with a strange pendant attached to it, that Edward didn't like the look of. He knew it was a symbol of something insidious. Edward's keen, astute, discerning eyes missed nothing. For being an only child, he'd become very observant over the years, and was much more grown up than other kids his age, and even the teachers at school said as much. Julia Barry suspected Edward's maturity was due to hanging around adults all the time, and listening to their conversations. Zara Witchen took a sip of her tea, and then placed her teacup on the saucer, her eyes now fixed steadily on Edward's mother, with an intensity that Edward thought was nothing short of disturbing. He'd love to have known what the slippery woman was thinking. "Did Angie tell you exactly what I am?" Zara Witchen asked breezily. in a light-hearted, carefree tone of voice. Julia Barry chuckled rather uncomfortably, but she nodded. It's hard to take it all on board. It came as a bit of a shock to me when Angie told me. I mean, if the truth be told, I never did believe witches actually existed in this day and age, especially here in North America. But Angie told me you're a practicing witch. In truth, I just couldn't believe there were any real witches around. I thought they all died out after the Salem witch trials, if indeed those women were witches at all, which I rather suspect they were not. So yes, if you really are a witch, I know one thing for certain. That is that you're not an evil one. You help people, which is why you're here. Angie emphatically believes you might be able to help me. She said that you could possibly make me up a potion that might increase my fertility and chances of falling pregnant. If you can do that for me, Zara, I will be indebted to you forever, and I'm willing to pay handsomely for any potion you might make up for me. Zara Witchen smiled. A broad grin stretched across her face, like a large elastic band. But her smile was not sweet, nor reassuring, instead decidedly unsettling. Witches get such a bad rap, said Zara Witchen nonchalantly. It's most unfair. Most of us want to do good in the world, but no one appreciates that. Of course, these days, many of us practicing the art of witchcraft have to hide our light under a bushel. We don't have a choice in the matter, you see. We keep what we do strictly secret. Just so you know, Mrs. Barry, contrary to what you may believe, witchcraft is alive and well here in America. But it is not something people actually know about. I never go around the place broadcasting the fact that I'm a witch. It's not a wise thing to do. Going back in history, women who worked with herbs and healing poultices were hung at the stake for being witches, when they were just herbalists trying their best to help people with alternative therapies that could be so much more successful than mainstream medicine. The Chinese have known the power of herbs for generations. When people don't understand the dynamics of something, they become incredibly fearful and call the practice of witchcraft demonic and of the devil. That's why these women were hung at the stake. They were considered a threat. Sometimes they were flung into the water to be drowned. If they drowned, they were not a witch, but it was just bad luck that they had been mistaken for one, for they had been falsely accused. If they didn't drown, then they were considered to be a witch, and would end up being burnt alive at the stake. It was too dreadful for words, believe me. And even today, if you admit to people you're a practicing witch, well, you get all kinds of negative responses. So those of us who indulge in this craft, well, we have to keep it secret, don't we? When you say you're a witch, I take it you don't have a broomstick or a black cat, Angie teased, raising a brow, as all three women laughed light-heartedly, as they thought Angie's impromptu joke was rather amusing, although Edward noticed Zara Witchen did not smile. Hearing Zara Witchen profess herself to being a witch made Edward's ears tingle. Everyone knew witches were evil, so what on earth was his mother doing entertaining one of all things? Maybe his mother wanted a magic potion made for him by Zara Witchen, in the hope that she would fall pregnant. That was what this visit was all about, Edward mused. But wasn't it unwise to invite a woman who professed to be a witch into their home, who had brought in with her an icy chill into their kitchen on a warm summer day, which meant she must have powers? Had his mother underestimated Zara Witchen, he wondered. Well, I did have a black cat once called Sooty, said Zara Witchen, but no, I didn't bob around the place on a broomstick at night. But yes, I am a practicing witch, and witches are real. But most of us in my profession brush what we do under the carpet. Some of us just pretend to be herbalists, to hide what we do, while we help people at the same time. I'm part of a coven of witches. I happen to be the head of that coven, the leading witch, so to speak. I learnt everything I know from my grandmother, who was also a witch when she was alive, and a very good one at that, with an incredible reputation, an unblemished one. I work with potions and spells, and I have great success in my art, and I usually get excellent results with the spirits I conjure up. But I need to tell you, When I conjure up a spirit, the spirit always wants something back in return. Some kind of sacrifice, so to speak. When it comes to your friend Angie, she brought a whole lot of fruit and buried it at the bottom of the garden under a tree, and that was satisfactory for the spirit, for it was hungry and craving something sweet. After that ritual, the spirit told me where Angie's dog Bo could be found, and gave me pictures in my head, and Angie was able to interpret those pictures, because she knew exactly where the field of buttercups could be located, and immediately contact Mr. Meaton to tell him about my vision. And luckily he admitted that there was a hole resembling a grave in the field that he'd recently dug up. So he took Angie to see it, and there was little Bo. So her wish was granted. I know, said Julia. That's why I asked my friend Angie to invite you around this morning. I'm not worried about the sacrifice. As I said, I will do absolutely anything for another child. I don't mind buying bucketfuls of fruit to bury at the bottom of my yard. As far as I'm concerned, that's a small price to pay, and a whole lot cheaper than some of those extortionately expensive fertility clinics that can rob you blind, let me tell you. Well, I'm very glad to hear you say that, Mrs. Barry, Zelda had said, but I feel I should offer you a cautionary note nevertheless, and that is to warn you that not every sacrifice the spirit demands is the same. It might not be fruit you're expected to buy for the spirit, but maybe the demands could be greater. Are you prepared for that? Absolutely, said Julia. Shouldn't you think about what Zara has just said? Said her friend Lisa, giving Julia a warning glance. I don't think you should rush into anything like this without thinking about it first, Julia. This is serious, you know. No, it's not, Lisa. Don't be so overreactive. That's not necessary, said Julia. I'm going ahead with this, Lisa. You know how much I want a baby. Yes, I know, Julia. That's the point. You shouldn't go rushing into things blindly. You don't know what you're talking about, Lisa. I do know what I'm doing, said Julia. Very well, said Zara. But before we start, Mrs. Barry, I need a drop of your blood to put in this black bottle of water, she said, pulling out a black bottle from her large leather bag that looked as if it contained everything, including the kitchen sink. Julia Barry had grabbed a needle from her sewing kit in the kitchen and pricked her finger very willingly, allowing a drop of her blood to slide into the bottle of water. She handed the bottle to Zara, who placed it on the table in a strategic position, of some importance it would seem. Another thing, Mrs. Barry, said Zara, pulling out a pair of hairdresser scissors from her bag and passing them over to Juliet. I'll need a lock of your hair, Mrs. Barry. Julia snipped off a lock of her hair obligingly. She handed the lock of hair and the scissors straight back to Zara, who placed the hairdresser scissors straight back into her bag, and then the lock of Julia's hair on the table next to the small black bottle that contained her blood. Julia's friend Lisa became increasingly uncomfortable, sitting around the kitchen table with her friends. It would seem she didn't know what she'd got herself embroiled in, and was not remotely happy with the way things were currently unfolding. She looked as if she would prefer it if the ground simply swallowed her whole, as right now she'd have been happy to be anywhere else in the world other than sitting around the Barry kitchen table. She kept passing Julia Barry warning glances, as if to say, Do you know what you're getting yourself into, Julia? But Julia Barry blindly ignored her friend. Zara Witchin pulled out some papers from her large leather bag. They looked as if they'd been torn straight out of a book, and appeared to contain some strange writing and funny-looking symbols. I will need to do an incantation, said Zara affirmatively, but we need to draw all the curtains in this kitchen to make sure it's dark in here, and then I will light up 6 candles that I have in my bag, she said. Zara Witchin pointed to the little black bottle that contained Julia's blood. When the black light during the incantation lights up with a purple light, it means the spirit has answered our request, and that you will indeed be able to have a baby, Mrs. Barry. But the spirit will expect something in return, which will be revealed to you in due course, I am most sure. But how will I know what the spirit wants me to do? Asked Julia. The spirit will intercede in your dream, Mrs. Barry, and let you know what is required of you. Fair enough, said Julia, nodding. Let's get on with it, shall we? My eggs aren't getting any younger, she joked, but nobody laughed. So there we are. That is the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.